The cardboard box was heavier than it looked. My mother's handwriting was on the side, neat, careful letters that spelled out my name, and underneath, in smaller print, "For when you're ready." I wasn't ready. I don't think I ever would have been. I'd driven 11 hours from Halifax to get back to Muskoka, through sleet that turned the Trans-Canada into a gray blur, with a cracked windshield and a heater that only worked on the passenger side. My fingers were stiff when I finally turned off the engine in the parking lot of Hartley and Sons Family Law. I sat there for a full minute before I went in. My brother was already inside. Of course he was. He was wearing the kind of coat that said he hadn't driven 11 hours in a car with a broken heater. He was leaning against the reception desk, laughing at something on his phone, and when he saw me come through the door, he looked up with that particular expression he'd had since we were kids, the one that said he was already done with whatever was about to happen. "You look terrible," he said. It wasn't concern. "Long drive," I said. He nodded once and looked back at his phone. The lawyer, a small woman named Margaret Cho, led us into a conference room with a laminate table and a window that looked out onto a parking lot coated in February ice. She offered us coffee. My brother said no. I said yes, and wrapped both hands around the mug when she brought it. I'd spent 11 months in northern Manitoba before this, a nursing posting in a remote community about 40 kilometers from the nearest Tim Hortons, accessible in winter only by ice road, the kind of posting that other nurses turned down. I took it because the salary supplement was substantial, because my student debt from Dalhousie didn't care about my reasons, and because honestly, I needed somewhere to be useful in a way that felt real. My brother called it hiding. He said that at Christmas 2 years ago, over my mother's butter tarts while she was still in the other room. "You're hiding," he said. "You could be working at a proper hospital in Toronto. You could be doing something with your life. Instead, you're playing hero in the middle of nowhere." I didn't answer. I ate my butter tart and looked out the window at the frozen lake behind my mother's house. She passed in October. A cardiac event, sudden enough that I'd barely made it back in time. I held her hand in the ICU at Bracebridge and talked to her about the ice road, about a patient named Raymond, who was 91 and still insisted on checking his trap lines, about the way the northern lights looked from the nursing station porch on a clear night. I don't know if she heard me. The nurse in me knew the statistics. The daughter in me kept talking anyway. She left us both things. My brother received the house on Torrance Road, the one where we grew up. The 4-bedroom with the wraparound porch and the dock and the view of the water that real estate listings in Muskoka charged extra for. He received the investment accounts, the furniture, the car. I received a storage locker in Gravenhurst, number 47, and a key on a yellow plastic tag. My brother read the will summary before Margaret had finished speaking. He set it down on the laminate table and looked at me with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt but landed somewhere uncomfortable between them. "That's what you get," he said, "for being away." Margaret cleared her throat. I kept my hands around the coffee mug. "There's a note," Margaret said, and slid a sealed envelope across the table toward me. My name in my mother's handwriting. My brother glanced at it. "Is there one for me?" "No," Margaret said. He gathered his copy of the documents, buttoned his coat, and walked out without another word. The door swung shut behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. I sat with the envelope for a long moment before I put it in my bag. I didn't open it in the car. I drove to the locker facility through the sleet, which had turned to proper snow by then, the kind of heavy, wet Ontario snow that sticks to everything. The facility was on a service road off Muskoka Road 169, behind a propane supplier and next to a self-serve car wash that had a hand-lettered "closed for winter" sign in the window. It looked exactly like the kind of place where nothing important ever happened. Locker 47 was in the second row, ground level. The yellow tag was cold in my hand. I stood in front of the corrugated metal door for longer than I should have, in the snow, in my inadequate Halifax coat that was not built for a Muskoka February, and I thought about what my brother said. "That's what you get, for being away." I turned the key. The locker was full of filing boxes. Not junk, not the accumulated disorder of a life being cleared out. Boxes, organized, labeled in my mother's handwriting. Financial records, correspondence, property documents. And in the far right corner, a fireproof lockbox, the kind you bought at Canadian Tire for important papers, with a combination dial. The combination was my birthday. I knew before I tried it. Inside the lockbox were 3 things: a letter, a manila folder, and a USB drive in a small Ziploc bag with a sticky note that said, "Ask Margaret." I read the letter standing up in the snow with the locker door open behind me. She started by saying she loved us both. She said that clearly, without qualification, and I believed it because I knew her and because it was true. Then she said, "I know what you've given, even when no one was watching. I know what it cost. A mother notices, even from far away." She told me that the house on Torrance Road came with a mortgage she'd taken out 6 years ago to cover the renovation and my brother's business loan. The second one. When the first failed. She told me that the investment accounts would cover roughly half of what remained. She told me that my brother knew about the mortgage, had always known, but that she'd asked him not to mention it because she'd been embarrassed, and he'd agreed, because it suited him to agree. She told me that the storage locker was not a consolation prize. She told me that 47 held the records for something she'd never told either of us about, that 20 years ago, after my father died and she was 42 years old, and alone with 2 kids and a seasonal rental property and almost nothing else, she'd started quietly. A small investment in a commercial property in Gravenhurst, bought at a tax sale for almost nothing. Then another, then a third. She'd managed them herself, kept the rents fair, reinvested the income, said nothing, because she was afraid if she said it aloud it would disappear, and then afraid because it hadn't. She wrote, "I am leaving you what I built with my own hands, because you are the one I watched build things with yours." The house was always going to go to him, because that's what he's always expected, and I learned a long time ago that giving someone what they expect is not the same as giving them what they need. What I'm giving you is what I earned when nobody was paying attention. I hope you understand the difference. The manila folder contained 3 property deeds, 2 commercial properties on Muskoka Road, 1 residential unit near Bracebridge. The USB drive, Margaret would explain when I called her the next morning, contained the complete financial records and rental agreements, 18 years of careful documentation, everything I'd need to manage what turned out to be a portfolio generating roughly $4,000 a month in net rental income. I sat in the car for a very long time. The snow had taped itself against the windshield. I watched it build up in the corners of the glass and thought about my mother at 42, standing somewhere by herself and deciding to start something, telling no one, doing it anyway. I thought about her managing rental properties while I was in university, while I was in Manitoba, while I was up at 3 in the morning with a patient having a crisis, and she never said a word. She'd built something, in secret, for someone she trusted to understand why. I cried in the car, which I'm not embarrassed to admit. I cried for a while. Then I called Margaret. My brother called 2 days later. I was staying at a motel in Gravenhurst, not the nicest one, but it was clean and the parking lot was plowed going through the filing boxes, with a notepad and a coffee from the Tims down the road. He'd been to see the house. He'd had it assessed. "There's a mortgage," he said, as if he was telling me something I hadn't known. "I know," I said. A pause. "It's significant. I know that too." Another pause. He was recalibrating. I could feel it through the phone, the moment when someone realizes that the conversation they prepared for isn't the one they're in. "Mom's financial situation was more complicated than I realized," he said carefully. "I think her financial situation was exactly as complicated as she wanted it to be," I said. Silence. I let it sit there. He said more quietly, "What did she leave you?" It wasn't really a question. Or it was a question, but not one he expected an answer to. "Records," I said. "Documents. Things to go through." I wasn't lying. I also wasn't offering more than that, and he heard it and I could feel him deciding whether to push. "The estate lawyer said there were properties," he said. "There were properties listed in the will, yes." "What properties?" "I'm still going through everything," I said. "It's a lot of paperwork." He said, "You know, everything I've done for this family. I kept an eye on her when you were up north. I was the one who was here." I put down my coffee. I looked at the window of the motel room, at the snow sitting on the sill, at the parking lot beyond it. "You were here," I said. "Yes. You were here when she took out the second mortgage to cover your business loan." The silence this time was different. "That was a temporary. I'm not arguing about it," I said. "I'm just saying, you were here." He didn't say anything. "I need to get back to the paperwork," I said. "I'll call you when I've had a chance to understand everything properly." I hung up. I sat there for a moment with my phone face down on the motel bedspread, and I thought about what it would be like to call him back and read him the letter. To tell him everything. to watch metaphorically the expression on his face. I decided not to. Not yet. Not like that. Margaret had connected me with an accountant she trusted, a woman named Sandra Ferreira who worked out of a small office in Bracebridge and was, according to Margaret, exceptionally thorough. Sandra looked at the records and the USB drive and called me the next afternoon. "Your mother was good at this," she said. "Whoever helped her set this up in the beginning knew what they were doing." There was a name in the early correspondence, a financial planner my mother had seen once, just after my father died, one appointment. She'd apparently taken notes, implemented everything herself, and never gone back. "The properties are in reasonable shape," Sandra said. "2 of them have tenants, long-term, both reliable payers. The residential unit has been vacant since October. Your mother was managing it personally and hadn't relisted after her last tenant moved out. That one needs some attention." "What kind of attention?" "Nothing structural. Some updating. The kitchen is functional but dated. In the Bracebridge rental market right now, a modest renovation would significantly increase what you could charge, and the unit would rent quickly. You're looking at maybe $12,000 to $15,000 to do it properly, and you'd recover that within a year at current rates." I wrote it down. "You'll want to formalize the management structure," Sandra said. "Right now it's informal. Your mother was doing everything herself. Rent collection, maintenance coordination, tenant communication. You'll want to decide whether you're doing that or hiring a property management company. What would a property management company cost? Roughly 8 to 10% of gross rental income. Given your situation, you're working full-time elsewhere, presumably?" "I'm a nurse. I have a posting that runs through March. Then I'm deciding what's next." "Then property management is probably worth it," she said. "At least while you're establishing yourself." I wrote that down too. I extended my stay at the motel. I drove to each of the properties. I stood in front of them the same way I'd stood in front of Locker 47, not quite ready, not quite believing. The commercial properties were a small office building and a retail unit, both occupied. I met the tenants, a physiotherapy clinic, and an insurance broker who'd been in the same space for 11 years. They were polite and slightly cautious, the way tenants are when ownership changes. I told them I wasn't planning any changes, and that I'd be in touch once I'd had the chance to review everything properly. They both seemed relieved. The residential unit was a 2-bedroom apartment above a garage on a quiet street near Bracebridge, solid brick construction, good bones, terrible linoleum in the kitchen. I stood in the empty kitchen and looked at the terrible linoleum and thought about my mother choosing this property, and then choosing not to talk about it, for almost 2 decades. I called a contractor, Sandra recommended. He walked through with me and gave me a number that was inside Sandra's estimate. I said yes. My brother called again on a Thursday evening. He'd been to see his own accountant, he said. He'd had the mortgage on Torrance Road properly analyzed. He knew the numbers now. "I need to talk to you," he said. "About the estate, about the full picture." "Okay," I said. "Can you come to the house?" I thought about that. Torrance Road. Where we grew up. My mother's porch, her dock, her kitchen where she'd made the butter tarts while my brother told me I was hiding. "I can come Saturday," I said. He opened the door before I'd finished knocking. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping, which I noticed because I was a nurse, and I noticed things like that, and also because I knew my brother, and this wasn't his usual expression. He'd made coffee, which surprised me. He'd put out cups, which surprised me more. We sat at the kitchen table, my mother's kitchen table, which still had the ring stain from a coffee mug I'd left there in 1998, and he looked at the tabletop for a moment before he looked at me. "The mortgage is larger than I thought," he said. "I know. The investments aren't going to cover it. After taxes and estate fees, I'll have a gap." "I know that too," I said. He looked up. "How long have you known?" "Since I read her letter." His jaw tightened. "She wrote you a letter?" "Yes." He looked back at the table. He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched him turn something over, some version of himself that he was deciding whether to hold on to. "The properties she left you," he said. "What are they worth?" "I'm still working through it with the accountant." "Roughly." I could have been more precise. Sandra had given me a preliminary estimate. Instead I said, "Enough." He put his hands flat on the table. He was 41 years old, and I could see our father in his face in a way I hadn't seen since we were children, and I felt the complicated thing that happens when you've been angry at someone for so long that the anger is just part of the landscape, and then you sit across from them in your mother's kitchen and see how much they look like someone you missed. "I need help," he said. It cost him something. I could see it. I didn't say anything. I can't cover the mortgage gap on my own, he said. Not immediately. The business is still getting established. The third business, I said. Yes. After the two that my mother helped with. He looked at me. Is this where you tell me what you know? I'm not here to tell you what I know, I said. I'm here because you asked me to come. He was quiet. I said, Mom knew you. She knew you completely. She wasn't fooled, and she wasn't bitter. She loved you, and she helped you when you needed it. And she also did what she did because she knew who could carry it. That wasn't a judgment. It was just who she was. He looked at the window. She wasn't punishing you, I said. She was trusting me. Those are different things. A long silence. So what now? He said. I'd thought about this in the motel room, in the car, in the empty kitchen with the bad linoleum. I'd thought about the version of this where I said nothing and let him manage on his own. I'd thought about the version where I was generous in a way that was just a different kind of winning. You keep the house, I said. You figure out the mortgage, I'll connect you with Sandra. She can help you look at your options. There are ways to restructure. The house is yours, that's what Mom wanted. But I'm not absorbing the mortgage gap. He nodded slowly. What I will do, I said, is what Mom actually did, which is show up when it matters, and not make a show of it. He looked at me. She called me every week, I said. From Manitoba. 52 weeks a year. She never mentioned the properties. She asked about my patients and she told me about the ice on the lake, and she made me feel like being up there was exactly what I was supposed to be doing. That's what she did, quietly, while she was also doing everything else. His eyes were doing something that he was working not to let happen. That's what I intend to do, I said. I'm going to manage what she built. I'm going to do it well. And if you need help, real help, the practical kind, you can ask me. Like a person. Not as a transaction. He nodded once, tight and small. Okay, he said. We drank the coffee he'd made. It was decent, he'd always been better at coffee than me. We didn't talk about the estate again. We talked about the house, about the dock that needed new boards, about the particular drama of the Muskoka Spring when it finally decided to arrive. I didn't tell him the number from Sandra's preliminary estimate. I drove back to the motel through dark that had gone clear and cold, the kind of northern Ontario night where the stars look like they've been shaken down close, and I thought about my mother at 42, deciding in private to build something that no one would know about for 20 years. I thought about Manitoba, about Raymond and his trap lines, about standing on the nursing station porch at 2 a.m. in January and watching the lights move across the sky. I thought about what it meant to do something useful in a way that felt real, even when nobody was paying attention. Especially when nobody was paying attention. The motel parking lot was empty and bright under the security lights. I sat in the car for a moment after I turned the engine off. The heater ticked. I took the envelope out of my bag. My mother's handwriting. For when you're ready. I'd read the letter twice already. I read it again. At the end, below her signature, she'd written one more line. The kind of postscript that meant she'd thought of it after she thought she was done. The linoleum in the Bracebridge unit needs replacing. I kept putting it off. I thought you'd handle it better than I would. I laughed. There in the car. In the empty parking lot, by myself. Then I got out and went inside. And I started making a list.